We have runoffs here in Memphis and city council district elections. They cost a lot of money for the taxpayer, lots and lots of money. And we've had elections where 1,000 people have voted. I think there was one down in Whitehaven where a lady was elected to the school board, and I think there were just give or take 1,000 votes. And there aren't that many more for city council races in the more activist areas of the city. So it's just a very large expense for a process that could be effectuated by this IRV system and do it all at one time, save the taxpayers a lot of money, and not have as much money in politics. Because if you eliminate that runoff election, you eliminate going to developers and special interests to get money.
Right.
So I see it as a reform measure and a cost-saving measure.
Well, I think both are true. The last point in particular, I mean, you have, how many campaigns have you personally been involved in over the years when you add it all up?
I would imagine 50 or 60.
Okay. And so you know probably better than anybody what it takes in order to raise money for a campaign. And particularly for someone starting out, a first-time candidate running for something like school board or city council, how much of a benefit would it be to such a candidate to have to only raise money for one campaign as opposed to two campaigns under the current system?
Oh, it's much, much better. I mean, anytime you have to raise money, it really, there's a need for people to have input. But the input shouldn't be based on their wealth. It should be based on their being part of the community. Right. And so when you have an extra layer of finances, and it can be even more important in a runoff, particularly if there's an incumbent who has the access to money and can get that money for a runoff election, it takes the elected official further away from his or her community base.
Right, right. And you mentioned before that only 1,000 people, or maybe a little bit more, will show up in Memphis runoff elections. We should probably talk a little bit about who those 1,000 people are and how they compare to the people who show up in the first round. Our own data has shown that the demographic profile of the people who show up in the first round is a little bit different from that 5% that shows up in the second round, and that has to do with, for whom is it more difficult to get back to the polls over and over again? Who are
I would suspect you're talking about people with disabilities,
right,
and people who have jobs and don't have the working for somebody and not self-employed, so it makes it less likely they're going to get off. And to go once and vote for 3 or 4 or 5, 6 different offices, you vote for your 2 or 3 at-large city council people, your district, your school board, your mayor. There could be another position. But to go for just one race, it's unlikely that those people will have the time, the inclination, or the ability to get out and vote. So it just comes down to somebody's hardcore base.
Right, and I think that's right. The political insiders. I mean, our own analysis of elections in Memphis shows that the drop-off in turnout is greatest among the lowest income parts of the city, and also if you take a look at each individual precinct, the blacker the precinct, the higher the African American percentage in the precinct, then the greater that drop-off in turnout. So I think it comports with your own intuition that people of color, people who are working 2 jobs, the disabled, people with transportation issues, mobility issues, they tend to drop off more, and basically political insiders.
And young people, too.
Yes. Yeah.
They hardly vote at all, but if they vote, it's going to be for a larger election where there are lots of campaigns encouraging them to vote.
Right. Now, one of the referenda would kill instant runoff voting in a different way. Rather than returning to the system that we've just been describing, where we have to come back to the polls a second time, it would say, well, you don't have to have a majority of the vote, so you could win with 20% of the vote. What are your thoughts on that, the arguments about that?
Well, the district council people are supposed to be close to the grassroots, as distinguished from the at-large council people. And it does seem that in those situations, and I guess it was the federal court that ordered it, because all this came out of a federal court ruling.
They permitted it, yeah.
That it would make more sense if the person could get a majority
right.
Of the votes cast in the election, or in the runoff. It still would be the plurality. Well, it's just the final 2 in the plurality.
Yes, that's right,
So
that's right.
generally be a majority unless there's some write-in.
Yeah, we've seen situations in which a candidate who may have been favored by a majority has not emerged on top because the vote was split among many, many different candidates of a similar view. So, for example, Erica Sugarman is going to be coming here in a little while. She recently ran in a super district race using a plurality system. There were 3 pro-labor alternative candidates to the incumbent, and Ms. Sugarman was among them. They split that vote, and as a result, the incumbent skated by with about 30% of the vote. But had that vote not been split, then probably Erica Sugarman would have won. So there's an illustration there of how instant runoff voting can help us, with making sure that incumbents don't have too much of an advantage in city council races.
And that was an appointed incumbent, so
Right.
it was even worse.
Right. Exactly. Right. And then also, I think you also took a position on the term limits referendum as well. Would you want to discuss your views on that?
Personally, I'm really not in favor of term limits in general, but on the local level, I can see it. But it's been voted on by the people already, and this is the thing that really makes me want to encourage people to vote no on this. Is it's just a sham, and it really is an affront to democracy. It's been passed. There are term limits of 2 terms in Memphis, whether you like it or not, and now they want to extend it to 3 terms and make it appear that this is some type of term limit election to the term limit people, when really it's an anti-term limit vote.
Right.
So it's the fact that it's not clear. They didn't do what they were required to by law to discuss the proposition, but they are just basically hoodwinking the people and trying to stay in office for another term. And it's when you're an incumbent, you're supposed to be straight with the people and abide by the law.
Right. Now, you just made, I think, are 3 very important points. One is that a lot of this is being fueled by the desire of incumbents to make it easier to stay in power longer. I think that also applies to instant runoff voting, which tends to make elections more competitive. You also mentioned that the people already voted for this, so if we're going to respect them, we ought to not have term limits. I think arguably that same argument applies with instant runoff voting. And then you also mentioned the misleading ballot language. Tell me what you think. I think you can make an argument that all of that also applies with respect to the 2 different referenda that would kill IRV.
Well, IRV would save money, and that's not put on the ballot as it's supposed to be.
Right.
The fiscal impact is supposed to be disclosed and discussed. The second, with the term limits, it's a bamboozle, and it just makes me think poorly of the entire process of government we have in our city.
Mm-hmm.
The city council people are not being trying to set up a system that's a good system. They're not thinking of Plato at all. They're thinking of themselves.